I'd like to first just establish a baseline first, if I could, about what is Digital Xtra Fund and what we're trying to achieve. I won't do too much about this, but basically back in 2014, Scotland and SDS, Skills Development Scotland, got together. And it's interesting how things come full circle for anyone who's just read the Logan Review. But back in 2014, they identified extracurricular activity as something that is key to engaging more young people in tech. And Claire last week talked about science capital and STEM capital, and very much that is what is part of what Digital Xtra Fund and extracurricular activity is trying to do, is build that STEM capital width of school. And if you're not familiar with STEM capital, I won't get into it too much, but maybe just do a quick Google of it. It's a report by UCL on sort of what is needed to get more young people interested in STEM. So in 2016, Skills Development Scotland basically got the money together, created the first 2 grant award cycles. So again, Claire mentioned there that she was a previous recipient in that first initial round with Coder Dojo. I actually was also a recipient in that initial round with Edinburgh Science Festival, which is where I came from. The first 2 rounds were structured a little bit differently than we're structured now. You had to go through Public Contracts Scotland, which is the Scottish government procurement system. So it was a little bit more intimidating. They also had much larger grants, to be honest. There was up to 25 and 50,000 pound grants. So they were basically paying for entire projects. The idea was always to make it a charity, though, to spin it out to be independent and for it to work a lot more with the private sector than relying on public sector input. So in 2017, we became a registered charity with Scotland. And that's when I took over managing the fund. One of the first things I looked at was obviously the financials. And I realized that giving away 25 and 50,000 pounds, especially when we were a relatively new charity, we weren't going to be in business very long. So we changed the structure to be micro grants very quickly. And we've kept that structure ever since. And I like this a little bit better because instead of financing entire projects, we're basically giving up to £5,000 to schools or educational organizations for basically to pilot a project or to start up a project. Someone there mentioned kit is really expensive. Yeah, it is. And it's not often in the budget for schools. What also is expensive is training to use that kit. And so we've made, funding can be used for that, for example. So that is basically what we do. But at that £5,000 level, what happens at the end of that initial pilot, that year run, is there's a lot less of a funding gap for schools and organizations to cover. And so the hope is that sustainably, those projects will last a lot longer. And what we've found is that's true. We've had a really good success over the past 5 funding rounds, but 3 with me at the helm. Including the SDS initial funding, we've given away £660,000 to extracurricular activities. We've supported 80 initiatives across Scotland, and that's helped engage over 38,000 young people. And that includes the past year, which I'll be honest with you, was a challenge. We really had to pivot quickly. I'm pleased to say that early on, we predicted that this was going to be a significant challenge for the entire academic year, and we were right. And so a lot of the projects that were meant to be delivered extracurricular this year, we have allowed to say be delivered in class bubbles and whatnot. We don't need to dwell on that too much, but my point is more that we are a small charity that looks to really work with our grant recipients to see if we can help increase that impact. And if there are challenges that they're facing, we like to try and work with them to overcome those. So most recently, which is obviously why we're here this evening, we've launched the 6th round of grant funding. We have £75,000 available, although I can't officially say, but I'm going to say it anyway, because all I'm waiting on is someone to sign off on a press release, because everything else has been approved. But we received, speaking of Dundee, we received a large contribution from a new company called Chroma Ventures, which is the investment arm of 4J Studios, who some of you may know from the Minecraft game series. So they basically take Minecraft from the Swedish creator and convert it to run on Nintendo, Sony, and Microsoft platforms. So as you can imagine, they're doing all right. What a lot of people don't know is that they're based in Dundee and East Lothian. So they've actually got behind us as our newest Gigabyte partner. And so for this year, 2021, 2022, we're actually going to be awarding up to £100,000 now. So I'm really excited about that. But that's why we're here. And there is an application process. That's how we go through. So someone there just put Patty Burns as my cousin. Yes, Patty Burns is now on my board as well. If you look at the Digital Xtra Fund website and click on our board, you'll see his picture and bio there. For our American friend here, you know, Scotland's not that big. But yeah, and obviously you can probably tell from my accent, I'm not from Scotland either. I'm from Canada originally, but I've lived here for 15 years. So, but yeah, so I'm here to talk a little bit today about the application process. I wasn't sure which direction I was going to take with this because I wasn't sure if there was going to be a lot of people who have applied before. I don't see a lot of faces other than Claire who maybe have. So I might talk a little bit more about the application than I was planning, but obviously if you have any questions, I'll actually open the chat right now. Please let me know. I won't take too long because we only have an hour. The first thing I'll say is that I do recognize that it is slightly a meaty application. There is quite a bit to it. Not all the questions are necessarily there for my benefit. I can talk a little bit about this later on, but basically I think some of this is important for applicants to consider for their own potential success as well. So I will assume that you've all looked at the application. That is one assumption I'm going to make. If you haven't though, I will encourage you to go to the Digital Xtra Fund website, which Kelly has very kindly put up in the comments, and download the application. There's also guidelines there, of which there's 15 pages. So again, that is a significant amount of content, but I'm one of these people who likes to say too much than perhaps too little. We have also just launched our YouTube channel just literally last week. A lot of the guidelines are discussed in that YouTube channel as well. So if you're really not keen to sit down and read those pages, you can probably get a significant amount of that from our channel. There's also some case studies there as well. And you can look at those to see sort of the types of projects that we supported in the past. On that note, you know, I noticed there's quite a few schools here, but actually the point of Digital Xtra Fund is to provide funding to extracurricular activities from not just schools, but also from educational organizations. So anyone who can apply. As I mentioned in one of the videos on the YouTube channel, we've partnered with registered companies, registered charities, schools, colleges, universities, local authorities, trade bodies. As long as they're engaging young people age 16 and under in technology, then they can basically apply to Digital Xtra Fund. So it's not who you are, but what you do that is important when it comes to applying. There probably the one exception is perhaps sole traders. If you are a sole trader looking to apply, I'd suggest maybe partnering with a school or a college or something, and you be a contractor and sort of list you in the budget. But again, if you have any questions specifically about that, let me know. Once you open the application, the first section is the eligibility check. Very, very quickly, just run through it, make sure that you are able to apply. But like I say, it's very, very broad. Then there's details of who's applying. And then there's 11 questions. I won't highlight them all right now. Again, just go to the YouTube channel or read the guidelines if you want to do it. But I will highlight a few if that's okay. Maybe I'll pause for a second because I realize I've been talking for about 10 minutes straight here. If anybody has any questions now before I move forward. No. Brilliant, good. I'm either really hitting all the points or I'm really bad, so we'll see. But so the first question, and like I said, I'm not going to go through them all, but the first one is important, as you can probably imagine. It's a summary of activity. And this is one of those questions that you really need to practice, I think. And when I say practice, write down what you want to write down and maybe get someone who's not familiar with your activity whatsoever to read it and make sure that they understand it. Because often when you're in that bubble of what you're trying to say, it sometimes seems obvious to you, but it isn't obvious to other people. And this would maybe be a good time to tell you a little bit about how the applications are reviewed. I have a panel of people who come from industry as well as the public sector and the education and skills sector. Each application is read by 3 or 4 panelists independently. They are sort of randomly selected. So there's a good chance they won't know anything about you, your organization, or your activity. So you really have to make sure that in this question, you're explaining what the young people will be doing so that someone who has no knowledge of any of that can understand that. And if they don't understand it after they've read that question, it really kind of makes it difficult to get them engaged with the rest of the application. They really have to have a clear picture of what you're trying to achieve. This isn't a question to talk about why you should receive it or when or where it will be delivered. This is purely describing what the young people will do. And like I say, at the end of that, you really should have almost as good an idea as if they were sitting there as to what it is that you'll be delivering. The why would come in question 2, which is objectives. So within the guidelines, there's a number of objectives of Digital Xtra Fund, of which first and foremost is to get more young people engaged in digital tech and hopefully put them down a pathway to a career in technology. But there's a number of other objectives there too, and this is the place to sort of talk about why. One part that's new for this year is question 2B, which is cyber resilience. So we've been supported by the cyber resilience team at Scottish Government this year to help them identify some extracurricular activity that engages young people in cyber skills. This is a new element, so we've highlighted this. I'm highlighting this question because if you've applied before, you wouldn't recognize it. If you are not a cyber skill focused activity, I would just leave this blank. It won't impede your application. It's just to help us identify those that are focusing on cyber skills, and so we can basically pass those on to Scottish Government, to the cyber resilience team. As I mentioned, there are a minimum of 2 grants that are up for grabs with that. But if we receive 3 or 4 applications that are brilliant that focus on cyber skills, then that 2 is just a minimum. The 3 is targets and outcomes. Again, that's just the who and the where. So I won't go into that too much because that's straightforward. I will mention, though, actually, if you are delivering remotely, which is obviously becoming an increasingly important part of education at the moment, at least, it can maybe perhaps be difficult to identify where your where the young people who are joining you might be from. I mentioned earlier, we are a flexible, small charity that's looking to work with our grant recipients. If you put something in here and it turns out that you've put 50 people from Edinburgh and it's 50 people from Stirling that join, that you're not going to lose your grant or something like that. So, don't worry about that. It's just a best guess based on maybe where your marketing is going or what organizations you're partnering with. Same with, your age and your gender, especially, schools, if they're planning to engage more older people and they find that more younger people are interested in their program, don't feel like you have to try and please don't feel like you have to push the younger people away to hit these metrics. That's not what it's about. This is just really to give us an idea of who you're trying to engage. And really for me to go back to my stakeholders, which is our sponsors, and say, this is what we're planning to achieve this year. We all know this might change. Goodness knows after the year we've had, it's changed a lot this past year. So it's not the end of the world if you don't hit those metrics. The second part of that question is a little bit more interesting from my perspective, if you will. So we want ideally all young people in Scotland to have the opportunity to engage with extracurricular activity and tech through school or through local organizations. That is the ultimate goal. I have a budget for that. I'm chasing that goal. But we have to do that incrementally. And the first thing we have to do is probably get those young people engaged that maybe aren't as engaged. And this goes back to some of the things that Claire was talking about last week. And I was really pleased to hear some of the points that she made because they reflect some of the things that we've been saying as well. So we identified 3 audiences that we really would like to engage if we can, although, like I say, our goal is all young people. And those audiences are young people from high deprivation. One of the resources, the main resource we use for that is the SIMD data that Scottish Government provides. It's public, but some people use Free School Meals Index, for example. Another one is young people in rural areas. And again, there's definitions of these in the guidelines. Both of those definitions came from Scottish Government. And any initiatives that target underrepresented people, underrepresented groups that are in the tech sector. And primarily this is girls and young women, but it certainly doesn't have to be any groups that you can show are underrepresented in the tech sector, you could put into this section. And we would ask you to just sort of talk briefly about why you are qualified or why you are able to engage that audience. Number 4 is personnel. This is who's running the activity. I would say maybe very briefly on that, it shouldn't just be the people who are frontline, but also talk about your supporting cast. A lot of times when we see one person listed in that question, that can sometimes be a red flag. So if you have a senior leadership team or a head of engagement who is very passionate about this, but won't actually be engaging the young people, that is sometimes just as valuable as the people who are delivering the activity. So make sure that you include them in personnel as well. 4B is microbits. We have a very good partnership with the Microbit Educational Foundation. We've actually donated over 3,000 microbits across Scotland over the past 3 years. Code-based Sterling has received a classroom pack from us. So this is more, again, sort of for the information for them. So it's not a scored question. So if you're not using microbits, please don't feel that your application will be penalized. This is purely for us to gather information for the Microbit Educational Foundation. If you are using microbits and you are successful, we also give you those microbits directly. So you don't have to actually pay for those. So it's an in-kind donation that we can provide. We don't really say that up front. So please include it in your budget still, but you'll see when you get to the budget, there's a line that says, if you're using microbits, please separate these out, and that's why. Question 5 is a brand new question, remote learning. So I'll spend a little bit of extra time on it just because it is brand new. Obviously, given the current situation, we hope that things are going to improve, but we are seeing elsewhere in the world where they're not. We have to be prepared, especially after the past year, that things may go back downhill again here in the UK. And well, specifically in Scotland, technically, because we're a Scottish charity. But so we have to be prepared for that. We weren't this past year. When things hit the fan last spring, we kind of scrambled a bit. I'm very pleased with what we achieved, but it was not easy. And so we want not only us to be aware of Plan B or just another plan, if you will, of how to engage young people if things happen again, but we want grant recipients to have thought of that as well. So it could be as simple as, I know for my son's school, for example, last spring when lockdown kicked in, nobody had Teams logins. Nobody knew how to use Teams. I mean, everyone now in Scotland, all Scottish students at least, should have Teams logins, or at least most do. And most people should at least have the basic knowledge of how to use Teams. So if you're a school, that's a little bit easier. But if you're not a school and you're engaging young people, at least you should be aware of that. And you could suggest that you would deliver some of these lessons, through Teams extracurricularly. What also you should be aware of is we're not expecting a like for like. It's interesting to see Michael from Robotical here. I work closely with Tanya Howden, who was at Robotical previously. I've had a few chats with Miles at Robotical and a couple other people there. So I love Marty. I think he's brilliant. I think he's a great local success story. I think he's a great tool for engaging young people. If you have 2 or 3 Martys for your code club, you're not going to necessarily be able to share that out with your participants. And I appreciate that. So, it doesn't have to necessarily be a like for like how you're going to deliver your exact plan remotely. What we're just wanting to ensure is that you have a plan in place to still engage young people about tech. And I want you to maybe look at your aims and your objectives more than your subject matter and how you might be able to still achieve those. So that could be through offline coding exercises. It could be through online platforms. It could be that they write their Marty code and send it in to you, and then you do a video of how their different programs work. There's different options there. So it's, again, just want to stress, we are flexible, especially in extenuating circumstances like that. And it's just more about getting young people engaged with tech. That is absolutely always going to be our focus. So please remember that when you're doing the remote learning. If you are remote from the outset, for example, with this question, maybe talk about why that's to your advantage or why you chose that for this particular question. Number 6 is real world context. And again, when Claire talked about this last week, I wasn't part of the call last week, but I watched it later on. I actually got quite excited when she was talking about this, so I wrote it down. She said, activities creative and or relevant to real life. And this is absolutely something that I am passionate about, perhaps more than anything when it comes to Digital Xtra Fund. And the ironic thing is when I started managing the fund, this wasn't even part of it. It was just purely about getting finance to people who needed it, which is important. But there wasn't this push about getting industry involved or providing context. To me, if you're trying to get young people to get excited about tech, I wrote about a recent LinkedIn survey in the guidelines on the first page, but basically 6 of the top 10 emerging careers in the UK right now are tech-based. And if you read the titles of them, you have no idea, unless you have at least the most basic idea of tech, what those careers are and how we're supposed to get young people excited. And again, it was interesting to hear Claire talk about, 13 and under was really sort of the target, because again, that's something that I've noticed that we're attempting to try and engage young people earlier and earlier. If you start talking to someone in primary about data protection officer or AI specialist, you're fighting an uphill battle. And so, but if we can get them some context about what cyber skills are, or data science or coding, and how that relates, how does coding a cat on the screen relate to the real world? And if you're not sure what I'm talking about with a cat, just check out Scratch. It's not a bad program. It's good for engaging young people, but you need to take that next step. And I think, unfortunately, with a lot of educators, they're not quite sure. At least that's what I gather from this question. Because if I'm honest, this is probably one of the most difficultly answered questions that we receive. The answers for this question are not particularly good. I'm not trying to be offensive or anything. I'm just trying to be honest with you that this is something that I think not just people on this call or people who apply, but people that are wanting to engage young people in tech, we need to think more about this. And they talked about some of the ways to do that last week. They talked about Girl Guides and Duke of Edinburgh. I know STEM Ambassadors, for example, they just did a massive reshuffle in Scotland. So I'm keen to sort of engage with them. It's now being ran at a circ. So I'm keen to engage with them and see how maybe this reshuffle could help. But also, CGI, JP Morgan, who are big multinational companies who are supporting Digital Xtra Fund because they want to get more young people engaged in tech. They're saying to me, we want to engage with these projects. We want to engage with young people. We want to help provide this context, but we don't know how. Typically what happens is they send a poll out to their employees and they say, right, who has kids in a local school? And it's like, okay, that's one way to do it, but that's very ad hoc. And if you're in a school that maybe has a slightly higher level of deprivation, it may be that the parents from that school don't work for JP Morgan or CGI and maybe don't have as much experience about tech. And again, I know, I keep talking about last week's talk, but it was great. You talked about how one of the things you have to overcome seriously is the misconceptions of parents around tech, especially around girls. And that's absolutely true, but not from the women who work at CGI or JP Morgan. So how do we get those women, for example, in front of young girls who maybe wouldn't have the opportunity otherwise? And so we're trying to do that. So I mentioned earlier, there is a new position that we're just advertising for. Applications are open until the 19th of April, actually, but it's for a new community and grants officer. And this is a new full-time role. It's a role I've been really pushing for a couple of years with the fund, but we've just managed to secure the funding for it. And this person, half their job is going to be bringing the grant recipients together with our industry partners to create collaboration and to foster knowledge about what the jobs are in the job market, and to try and tailor it so that if they're talking to a project that focuses on secondary versus a project that focuses on primary, how do you change that messaging and maybe how you would present the jobs so that it's still exciting for both those age demographics. The other half of this job is they're going to look at ethics of technology and tech for good, as well as meta skills alongside technical skills. Because what my industry partners are telling me is that they don't necessarily need smart people who know how to use tech, but they need people who have resilience, and they need people who have who are not afraid to fail. And so it's interesting to hear I mentioned earlier about there were some things that we might have done differently. I think about whenever someone says that to me, I think about a conversation I have with my son on a regular basis because he gets frustrated easily, and I say, what, failure is the best way to learn. Failure is by far the best way to learn, and it is nothing to be afraid of and nothing to be ashamed of. And that is not a technical skill, but it is absolutely a skill that we need to instill in our young people. And so this role will help with those types of lessons. So that's real world context, and it's broken into two parts because the first one is more general. How are you going to provide context to the skills that you're teaching? And the second one is specifically, how can you engage industry? Because ultimately that is my goal, but I realize that is probably a bigger ask, which is why we've broken it into two parts. I suppose I should stop now for a second again, just ask if anyone has any questions. No? Good. I said I wasn't going to do every question, but honestly, I feel like I am now. Number 7 is very, I'll just do it briefly. Basically, number 7 was in it last year, but it was titled differently and worded completely differently. It was called promotion. And it was basically, how are you going to promote your activity? And everyone just said, we're going to tweet about it. We're going to put posters up in the school. And I was like, yeah, that makes sense, but that's kind of baseline. What this question is really asking is, how are you going to overcome negative stereotypes? How are you going to engage young people so that they choose to come to you instead of competing clubs that are running at the same time? How are you going to get people excited about tech before they even step foot in it, into your club? We can provide funding to all types of activities, but if there's not bums and seats, it doesn't achieve what we want to achieve, and it doesn't achieve what you're looking to achieve. So this is probably an example of one of those questions that we want you to think about. That it's great for me to know this and for the panel to know this, and it's important, but more importantly, it's you need to think about this. And because if you don't think about how you're going to get those bums in seats, again, you're going to be fighting an uphill battle from the beginning. So that's why we've really changed the wording for that question to sort of make people think about specifically that point. Number 8 is evaluation. Again, that is probably a question that is more for your benefit than our benefit. I obviously have to talk to my stakeholders at the end and show them the impact of their funding. And so there is a midpoint evaluation and a final evaluation for grant recipients. It's not in depth, but we do need to do it. But this is more, again, you will need that data if you're looking for future funding from future funders or from sponsors or from your senior leadership team to give you a bigger budget. This data is showing that you've created impact. So my background isn't actually STEM engagement. My background is fundraising. I came from the Edinburgh Science Festival where I was a fundraiser. And before that, I was at Edinburgh University where I was a fundraiser. So I know the importance of being able to show that you have made an impact with that funding. And this is the opportunity for you to talk about how you're going to do that. Number 9 is sustainability. It's pretty straightforward. Like I said, our goal is for every young person to get access to tech activities. There's no way that's going to happen if after the year, 90% of the activities we support stop working. And so this question is, again, how are you going to sustain this beyond the 5K grant? Number 10 is budget. I'm not going to talk about that too much. If you have any questions, let me know, but we obviously have to know what you're going to buy. There is flexibility in this. The only flexibility the only place where there's not flexibility is the total grant amount once it's agreed and signed off. So if you apply for £3,000 and you find actually, I forgot to include VAT or whatever, unfortunately, when it's signed off, we can't, or you need to buy something different, or prices go up on Amazon. Unfortunately, we can't increase the grant after it's awarded. So just be aware of that. I'm not asking you to pad the budget, but just be aware of that. Also be aware that the way the grant works is you get 60% upfront when the project commences. You get 30% when the midpoint evaluation is submitted, and 10% when the final evaluation is submitted. So in terms of cash flow, you're going to need to be aware of that as well, that you aren't going to have the full 100% up front. Some people budget for that. Some people get interest-free loan from their parents' association, if you're a school, for example. How you deal with it. Some people don't. Some people in their project plan, which is the next question, don't run the full project at the beginning because they only buy 60% of the kit. Whatever works for you, but just be aware of the cash flow. The other thing is, I mentioned the grants are up to £5,000. But let's say your project is £10,000 or £20,000. That's absolutely fine. You could receive up to £5,000 from Digital Xtra Fund. You would have to show where the additional funding is coming from. If it's not confirmed yet, then you wouldn't receive that initial payment from Digital Xtra Fund until the rest of the funding is confirmed. But we will hold it for you. If the rest of the funding never comes in, then unfortunately your grant will be canceled because we won't fund something that isn't fully funded. So it's up to you if you want to take that risk or not. To be honest, most people apply for 5,000 or less, but it's up to you. And then I mentioned the project plan. A couple of things with the project plan. I would definitely make sure that anything that you're putting in the budget or the project plan, you've referenced up above in the application. Because if you read here as a panelist something new and you don't know what it's about, you immediately are like, I don't know, red flag. So make sure that this is only a place to really list things. It's not really a place to explain things. Some people struggle with the project plan, if I'm honest. Perhaps it's the layout that I put it as like an Excel spreadsheet. What I would say, if you're not sure how to do it, is think of it like your Outlook calendar or whatever calendar you use. You know, you have a date, what you're going to do, and then you just have to think about what the outcome is. And so if that's planning, if that's buying tech, if that's delivering lessons 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, however many, put them all in this project plan, put some time in there for evaluation. Think of it like a calendar, but with specific outcomes of what you want to achieve, even if that outcome is just complete lesson 2 on ethics and data or whatever. So that's the project plan. So I've kind of went through it all, even though I said I wasn't going to, but it seemed like I said, there was a lot of new faces here. So it seemed like that was probably the right thing to do. Now that that's done, does anyone have any questions?
What's the maximum you can apply for?
Up to £5,000. But if your project is more, then obviously you just indicate where the other funding is coming from. If your project is less, then you can only apply for what's in the budget. So we have had people say our budget is 2,500, but we're going to put in £500 contingency, which would be a massive contingency. But we have had that, and there is a due diligence process after the evaluation where you go through the application with me, and I would basically cut out that contingency. We don't fund contingency, so you'd apply for the 2,500, which is what your budget for. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Does anyone else have any questions they'd like to ask? I just want to say thanks, Kraig. That was really interesting. It's good to actually hear it all spoken through. Claire, you mentioned earlier on that you know what not to do, or is there anything you can tell us that you learned along the way that might sort of spur more questions?
Yeah, I think my one really focuses in on what Kraig was saying about how you're going to get engagement and how you think you can guarantee it. And it probably varies a wee bit depending on school-based ones are likely to be in a slightly better position this way, in that the kids are there. But certainly if you're doing extracurricular clubs, there is that possibility that the kids won't turn up. If you're working with young people in areas of multiple deprivation, that tends to go up a wee bit more as well, because sometimes the kids are leading very chaotic lives. They're not at the youth club you're in, and you're running the activity, and because they have a burning desire to carry out your project, they may get caught up in it and actually become really interested, but the vast majority are not there to do that. There's some who are going to be there because otherwise they would literally be wandering around out in the street in the rain. So it's kind of bearing that in mind. And I think the thing that I didn't do in advance was do enough work beforehand with my colleagues who actually run the youth clubs to find out what they and the young people themselves were interested in. So I think that's the main thing I would do differently. And one of the things that I'm trying to do at the moment is build up the confidence of our staff who run youth clubs, who don't tend to have a STEM background at all. But we have several who are very interested and have run STEM activities, but help them sort of grow their base of STEM club enjoying children and get them more support and build up that network of support through STEM ambassadors and Glasgow Life volunteers generally. So yes, that was my main takeaway, which led to a lot of sort of retooling, and not quite, certainly not in terms of numbers. We didn't get the outcomes we were hoping for, although the kids who didn't engage, I think really benefited and did some really good stuff.
Yeah, and I mean, I think, my hope as a funder when I hear something like that is that those kids that did enjoy it the first year and that did take something away from it will then go and the program will grow. These I have a sort of almost too narrow an outlook because I'm a funder of 1 year. But my real hope is that the projects that we support will go on for many more years. And we haven't done any sort of research on that as to where the projects have led to. Sometimes we do because, for example, there was a Port Ellen Primary School in Isla applied 2 years ago and were successful. And they did very, very well with their project. And so the following year, Bowmore Primary School, which was literally down the road from them, they applied And they basically said that we are going to now, where Port Ellen focused on, I think it was P4 to P6, we're now going to focus on nursery up to P3. And so they slightly bought some different kit and stuff, but we're going to work with Port Ellen and actually all the primary schools in Isla. And we're going to create this primary wide program using this basically library of kit that was purchased over 2 grants. So we do get some feedback like that, but yeah, and that, I love that type of feedback. But you know, my hope is that, you know, that the training that was given to the staff through Claire's program and the, you know, referrals maybe from young people who really did take something from it will help with that grow. That program will grow. Claire mentioned there something quickly as well. I'll say one of the other sort of assumptions, and I see there's a question there, I'll get to that in a second as well, but one of the other assumptions that is often made by applicants is how quickly it is to get a code club up and running, particularly a new one, especially if you have to go through a procurement office, if you're a school or a local authority. Procurement offices just double whatever you think lengthwise it'll take you to get the kit. And training as well. I really like this approach of like a cluster approach where multiple schools work together or work with a local code base or local secondary or local college. But again, the more moving parts you have, the longer it can take to get like training coordinated and stuff. So that initial phase, you need to really make sure that you don't, I would under promise and over deliver in that initial few months, if you will.
That was one of my major things, was that I'd not long been working for Glasgow Life. I'd previously been working with the Science Centre, which is a much smaller organisation, a very flat management structure. And Glasgow Life is this huge and I could not believe how long it took for things to go through procurement or to get anything done at all. Yeah, so that is a very good point.
Yeah. So I see a question there. It says, do you fund extra science tuition for pupils from areas of high deprivation whose parents have no knowledge of science to support pupils at home? I think it would sort of depend specifically on the case. If I sort of break that, if I sort of take off the whether the parents have no knowledge or not would be, I guess, somewhat irrelevant to whether we would fund it or not. It would probably go into other parts of the application as to why you should get the grant or not. But do we fund extra science tuition for pupils from areas? It depends what the tuition's going towards. I mean, if there was an organized activity like First Lego League, for example, where you do have to pay a tuition for a school or a team to enter, we have covered that in a grant before. Yes, so those teams can participate without having to put a cost to the family. If you were buying kit for the young people to use from home, yes, you could do that, although the kit needs to remain the property of the grant recipient. So you wouldn't be able to give that kit away. So at the end of the activity, you would need to get that kit back, or if it got lost or broken, then obviously then that's unfortunately your loss. I'm not sure if that's answered the question or not, but you know, for example, travel. Travel was something that wasn't included because for some reason SDS doesn't cover travel. I don't know why. So when the fund sort of transitioned to a charity, we initially didn't cover travel. Now we do. So you could pay for students to travel to an activity. I think the only thing I would need to point out is that we are looking for value for money. So if 50% of your grant is going to travel, that may or may not be considered good value for money. And that would probably vary basically on who's reading it. You know, I know last year there was, I won't say who obviously, but there was a successful grant recipient, and they had put a significant amount of money into budget for catering. And the panel really didn't see the value of this. Now, I did, because I have a young son, and when he comes home from school after school, the first thing he wants to do is eat, and he's not going to think about anything until he gets food. And so they had to have catering there to give to the kids so they could focus on the activity, which is, you know, a valid point. And so they put it in the budget, and that's fine that we covered that in the end. But where they probably fell down on was they did not clarify, and this is what I was sort of alluding to earlier, they did not clarify in the application why there was such a significant portion set aside for catering. And so that it wasn't that the catering wasn't important, they just didn't say why it was important. So I think, you know, you'd be careful if a significant portion of your budget was toward tuition or travel or something like that, because it is technically meant to be for extracurricular activities. So it would have to be a pretty integral part of your application to be considered important, considered valuable.
This is a question in a similar sort of vein, if perhaps you've answered it a bit already, but we would like to include like training as well for we're a small team, but our mentors, we would like to spend a portion of the money on training for the mentors. Is that something?
Yes, it is. You can absolutely put training in, as long as that training directly relates to the activity. So again, in the application, make it clear how that training will benefit the activity. And in a similar vein to that, if you need to pay for a supply teacher so that your full-time staff member can go on training, then the grant will cover that as well. But again, make it clear that that training is essential for the activity. I completely hope, I don't even think this is the, I mean, I know this is the case, but I think, I don't know if people realize it, I guess is what I'm trying to say. You know, it's encouraged that the kit and the training that is provided through Digital Xtra Fund is used in the classroom. It's used in the core curriculum. I am not trying to fund an extracurricular activity in a silo, but I am handcuffed, if you will, by the fact that I have to support extracurricular activity for young people. So whatever you put into your application, make sure that you make it very clear how this is a part of the extracurricular activity. If you are then using that training and that kit elsewhere, that's great. And don't feel like you can't mention that, because it just makes it more of a web of more of an ecosystem as to how this is why this is important. But you have to make sure that everything you include relates to that extracurricular activity.
Okay, because that's we would be applying for almost a pilot project, but I suppose our ultimate end goal would be to whatever kit and training we got out of that funding, we would be able to carry it over to the things we do with the schools. So that would be worthwhile mentioning then.
Yeah, I mean, that would be exactly the type of thing I would put in the question about sustainability. I think I'll highlight a few questions I've had in the past, maybe that are in a similar line. We've had questions: do we fund like training for teachers or training conference for computing science teachers? The training maybe, but only if it directly relates to that training is needed to deliver the extracurricular activity. So it couldn't be general CPD or CLPD. A conference, probably not. Parents, absolutely a massive part of young influence people. So we've had, can we do programs that target parents? No, unfortunately not. But we would do something that targeted families. The two key things for me as a funder is, and I recognize the importance of upskilling teachers, by goodness I do, and for reaching parents, please believe me, I do. But you know, the point of Digital Xtra Fund is to engage young people through extracurricular activity. So you have to make sure that both of those boxes are ticked, and all the other stuff is just, you know, spices to make it taste better. But you have to make sure that you tick those two boxes, or else as a funder, as much as I see the value in what you're trying to do, I'm not going to, not when I say I don't mean I myself. I actually make no decision whatsoever. It's done by the panel and by the board. But when I say I mean the charity cannot fund you.
Okay, that's really handy. Thank you. Any other questions? You can feel free to pop them in the chat if you don't want to put your mic on. No, nothing. And we've got 7 minutes left, but if no one has any questions, I'll just remind you that I'm going to, this has been recorded and I'll send the link out. It's an unlisted link. So you'll only be able to watch the video if you have the link. I'll send it out in the post-event email. So if you've missed anything, you can catch up on that with that. And if you have any further questions, I'm sure Kraig would be happy to answer them over email. What would be the best way to get a hold of you, Kraig?
Yeah, absolutely. You can, I mean, the generic email is info@digitalxtrafund.scot. Extra is spelled with an X, not an E. But I mean, you can actually, I'm just looking at my screen here, you can actually email me directly if you want. It's Kraig.Brown, but it's Kraig with a K, Kraig .BROWN @digitalextrafund.scot. Otherwise, you can reach me on LinkedIn as well. I'm very active on LinkedIn, and Twitter is very active as our sort of main charity, the main way that the charity engages with whomever. So you could drop a DM there as well. We're on Facebook as well, but I don't use that as much. So that's it. Yeah, 19th of April is the application for Community and Grants Officer. If there's anyone you know who's passionate about tech and young people, please tell them to check that out on our website under the news section. 22nd of April at 2 o'clock is the deadline. I might let it go over by an hour or two, but I'll be honest with you, if it comes in on the Friday or goodness forbid the following Monday, I have to draw the line. So yeah, so really no later, please, than 2 o'clock. I don't read all of the applications myself. That goes to the panel. We have to act pretty quickly. So what I basically do is I write down everyone who applied and all the main applicants. I send it out to the panel. I ask them to declare any conflicts of interest. Once I get that back, they have 4 weeks to evaluate the applications independently. We then come together and we share notes and share scores. Then in the 1st of June or beginning of June, I will be contacting those who have been recommended by the panel to move forward with a grant, to just go through that due diligence process that I talked to you about. But by the end of June, all applicants, so if you haven't heard from sort of mid-June, unfortunately, I'm sorry, you probably weren't successful. However, by the end of June, we will be contacting everyone anyway to say if you were successful or not. And activities need to be delivered between the 1st of July, excluding the planning process, which you obviously need to do beforehand, and the 30th of June, 2022. So all your engagement, measured engagement, needs to happen in that period. And then your evaluations need to be submitted for that final payment by the 31st of August, 2022. If you followed us in the past, you might also notice that this is a new time of year for us. We used to launch in August, but this past August with the pandemic and lockdowns, we agreed that that was probably a silly thing to do. So we delayed it to now. But actually, this works better for us because obviously July to the following June covers the academic year, whereas before when projects would run over a calendar year, you had summer holidays in the middle, which weren't ideal. So we will be following this timeline moving forward. So if you're not successful this time, or you decide not to apply because you're not quite sure yet, but you decide to apply next year, keep an eye out on us on social media and whatnot in January, February again for the launch of what will be round 7.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very, very much. I've really enjoyed this session. I found it really valuable. And Claire, thank you. I enjoyed your input as well. So I'll wrap it up then.